So tonight we'll learn about Faeders. So from Farmyard to Faeder, how a farmer helped unravel the mating mysteries of the rough. So by the end of tonight, I hope you'll understand what a Faeder is, but more importantly, show that anyone can make meaningful contributions to science, even if not in a professional capacity. Now, just remember, we're here in Alberta right now, at least most of us, I think. And I want to start by acknowledging that I'm talking to you from home on Treaty 6 land, probably just like most of you, but some might be zooming in from Treaty 7, 8, or maybe even 4 and 10. And as a recent settler, recognizing treaty agreements is important to me. One of the commitments made in signed treaties is to respect the rights of the first inhabitants of this land to continue to engage in their cultural practices. And while the context is very different, this talk will highlight how the ability to maintain an important cultural practice in my home province in the Netherlands led to important scientific discoveries. So with that, I'll take you across the Atlantic to the small country of the Netherlands in Western Europe, right there, and especially the province of Friesland there. So here we see another map of the Netherlands. In red, the province of Friesland. Just for scale, the Netherlands fits about 16 times in the province of Alberta, so you can only imagine how small just one province is. And as you may have been able to tell from my accent, I'm not from Canada originally, and in fact, I'm from Friesland in the Netherlands. And as a kid growing up, I already loved birds. So not surprisingly, growing up, I decided to study biology at the University of Groningen in the north. And there I did a master's in animal ecology. And I was quite lucky because at the University of Groningen, they specialize on ecological research, usually with birds. So that was good times for me. And my first master's project, I worked on reed buntings, a small sparrow-like bird. And there I was lucky enough to have a supervisor, Dr. Karen Bouwman, who was very patient and taught me to start to get good at handling birds. And over the course of my interaction with birds, I really developed an interest in bird migration. And to that end, I really wanted to work with Teune Spiersma. He had at the time just started his as a professor at the University of Groningen. And so I knew if I want to work on migratory birds, I had to work with him. So I approached him hoping to go to exotic places to travel along with the birds. But he said, you know what, you're a Frisian like me, which means you hopefully speak Frisian, and I need people that can work in the province of Friesland. So in this province, the Netherlands has two official languages, Frisian being one of them, and some people in the province of Friesland are not that comfortable in speaking in Dutch, so then it can be quite helpful if you speak their language. And maybe surprised to learn that Frisian is actually one of the bases of Old English, which ultimately, of course, led to modern English. And why this Frisian was important, we'll get back to later. So first, a bit more about the Netherlands. If you haven't heard of it, probably most will have. The first question I typically get asked is, do you live close to Amsterdam? Well, the answer depends on where you're from. If you're from Europe, I'm going to say no, it's quite a distance. If you're from North America, I'm going to say, yeah, I live close to Amsterdam, because the whole country, most people live within 2.5 hour drive of Amsterdam. That's sort of the limit, unless you're on one of the islands. What you can tell already on the picture on the right here, that image is there's lots of rivers, water, and coastline. And we see that here as well on the left on the Google Maps image. And if we look at an image detailing the level relative to the ocean average sea level, you can see that a large fraction of the country is actually below or close to sea level. All this water, both from rivers and sea, means that it's a very wet land, and that attracts a lot of birds, of course. Now, besides the size, there's quite a lot of similarities between Alberta and the province of Friesland. We have a lot of grasslands here, just like we do in the Netherlands. Both extensively managed grasslands or intensively managed grasslands. One difference is, of course, that you have a bit more hills and mountains in the background. The highest point in the Netherlands is just over 300 meters for comparison. And here in Alberta, there's lots of cattle, mostly for the beef industry. In the Friesland, like the rest of the Netherlands, also lots of cattle, but mostly for dairy. Now, there's of course one big difference, and that's the climate. The winters in Alberta get cold, and with that, food and water is out of reach for a large fraction of the winter in large parts of the province. Whereas the Netherlands, the winters are mild with barely any days below zero. So food and water remain available throughout the winter, typically. Usually there might be a day or two that's a bit frozen over. And what that means is that in Friesland alone, even from December to February, there's still almost 200 species to be found. And just to give some numbers and think again about the scale of the province compared to the whole of Alberta, there's about 600,000 geese overwintering, like the barnacle geese is one of them, just like greater white-fronted geese, and about 50,000 red nuts on the coastal mudflats. So huge numbers still throughout the winter. But it's not just wintering birds or breeding birds, but also many species that use the area as a stopover site, a site where they, during migration, stop for a while to refuel before continuing on. And the ruff is one of those species that uses the Netherlands and Friesland as a stopover site. Here on the left, we see a group foraging on a meadow. You can see that the grass has only just started to grow, so this will be somewhere end of March. And there's some black-headed gulls in the mix. Now, the ruff has a fairly extensive breeding range. They used to be common breeders in the Netherlands, but all the management issues taken to get rid of water so that farmers can work the land earlier in the spring means that a lot of the land has dried out too much for them to provide suitable breeding habitat. But they still breed in a few pairs in the Netherlands and England, but then mostly throughout North and Northwest Europe, across Russia, even all the way to Eastern Siberia. And then although most birds winter in Africa, there's also populations even as far south as Australia, but also India. You can see here the Middle East along the Mediterranean, and also some winter in the Netherlands. But the take-home message from this should be that based on the ring recoveries, we find that most birds that breed in Northern Europe and Russia migrate via the Netherlands to Western Africa. So that's the population of birds that we mostly see pass through on migration. At the time that this figure was made, the population size was estimated to be 2.5 to 4 million. Now that's a huge range, and the reason for that is that there's a huge range that this bird can be found, so it's very hard to get good estimates. And clearly the number has been going down, so I wouldn't know what the numbers are right now, but as with many birds that rely on meadows, their population is suffering. That's not what we'll talk about today, though. Now, as these birds migrate through the Netherlands, through Friesland, as they arrive at the stopover site, they look fairly bland, but in terms of waders, they're already quite variable. So here we see 3 different males with differences in feather color and bill color, and if we could see all their legs, probably also in leg color. However, these differences are starting to get bigger because the second week or the second half of April, they'll suddenly very quickly drop their neck and head feathers, and they look for little vultures for a little while and start growing these beautiful ruff and tufts and develop warts on their face as well. You can see some orange here, more yellowish on these 2 birds. You see there's quite a few different color patterns and combinations just in these 3 birds here. Now, researchers thought that was also quite interesting, so they decide to look at how variable those plumages are, how many variations are there. So they sampled 1,814 males. Now I would like you all at home to take a guess how many different variants they found. So let's see. You should see a poll now, and you can add your answer to it, how many variations you think there are. I'll let that run for a while and see what the audience thinks. It's pretty even right now. About half of you have answered, 3/4, going nicely. You would have 20 more seconds to give people a chance that haven't been able to figure it out. 80% of you have. Great. Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. Okay, I believe everybody can see it. Let me know to speak up, Anne, if you cannot. Most of you, 50%, over 50% thinks there's about over 200 variations. And then 33% say 93 and 14% say over 800. Excellent. So let's see who was right. Well, I'm going to be a bit sneaky now. I'll give you some more information that you might have liked to use before answering that question. So when they carefully analyzed the birds, they found that there's 11 base colors of the ruff and tuft. And with that, a whole number of spots, 4 different types of spots, 4 different types of stripes, and then 6 sort of random type patterns. Additionally, just not the ruff, also the tuft can vary in color. So that leads to about 5 million theoretical variations. That's not how many they found in their 1,814 samples, of course, but they found 801 different combinations. So they're incredibly variable. The question is, of course, why do they have this amazing variation in their plumage? Well, and to that, we're going to have a look at some of their fascinating mating behavior, because this is a lacking species. So in this little snippet from the BBC, hopefully it works, we'll get to see what it looks like on a lac.
The tundra's most extravagant visitors have just arrived. Male ruffs, desperate for attention. This is a lecking ground. Here, males defend their own tiny patch of tundra, performing elaborate dances to seduce their female audience. Whenever boundaries are crossed, fights break out. But there are some who don't play by these rules. Ruffs with white feathers are genetically different. They will never hold a dancing patch of their own. They're less aggressive than the other males. And perhaps that's why the dominant dancers tolerate their presence. But white ruffs have their own mating strategy. He'll endure the leading male's ego if it means he can get a little closer to the ladies. But too close, he's quickly put back in his place. He'll need to be a little sneakier. Perhaps he can trick this orange-maned male. An intruder interrupts. This is his moment. The white ruff steals the show. And there's nothing his competition can do about it. He'll take every chance he can get. And with endless daylight on his side, he has plenty of time to push his luck.
Excellent. Could everybody follow that properly? I see in the chat someone to confirm. Excellent. For those that are pretty good with European bird calls, the calls we heard there were not by the ruffs. They were actually by redshanks. But I guess they took some creative liberty and added some vocals as well. Pretty impressive though. Beautiful images as well. So just to sort of explain what was happening there. So as mentioned, the ruff is a lacking species, which means that males gather in particular locations where they do displays, and then females come by and select a male. And what's special about ruffs is that there's a couple of different roles. So we noticed in this case that was a non-white male. These are the resident males, as they call them, independent males, I mean. They will defend the tiny little patch on a lacking site. And in some cases, when there's a satellite, here seen in the white bird, as mentioned in the video as well, they do not hold their own little patch on the leg, but they'd rather join one of the independent males. Now you wonder, why would an independent male ever allow for a satellite to join him? Well, research has shown that females are more attracted to patches on the leg where there's a satellite with an independent male. So it increases the chance of a female, the females come visit in little groups, of a female choosing that particular spot on the leg. The risk is, of course, that he might use the pairing, the mating, to the satellite, as we saw in this video. But it's sort of a stable strategy where both strategies can be present. And as is often the case with such sort of extreme mating behavior on these legs, the males are a lot bigger than the females. So here we see a female in the hand, and it maybe shows a bit better when we have a flock here flying from the title slide. You can see that's a female. There might be another female to the far left. And you can see that she's about half the size as a male. So a huge size dimorphism in this species. Now, not surprising, ruff are the subject of many different studies. A lot of people have been interested in them for a long time. Even as this painting shows from the late 1700s, early 1800s, people were already fascinated by this species. Now, I will talk about one particular exciting study on this species, but before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about science on which all this work is based. And specifically, I would like to hear and talk about the elements of the scientific method. And I would like to hear from you at home, whether you can share any of the elements of the scientific method. You can just type them in the chat and see if you can get any. Right, so how do we go about doing science? What is our process? What things come into play there? Doesn't matter if it's wrong, just try, see what you think. Experiments, very good. Anything else? Very good, Brian. Systematic observation. More observation, yeah. Recording data, excellent. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Documentation, very important, yeah. Testing hypotheses. Well, I think we've got all scientists in the chat here. Okay, thank you. So, oops, next slide here. So I omitted the observations here because that often gets forgotten. So people will often question, and from there you get a hypothesis and predictions alongside those. And then you get to test or do additional observations. And if the test does not disprove the hypothesis, you can test additional predictions to further strengthen your hypothesis, your belief that your hypothesis is correct. If it does not support your hypothesis, you need to revise it or make a new one. And like I said, this is not a complete picture. We really need to start with observations. That's how all science should really start, is by doing observations. And that is something that the hero of today's talk is very good in. Joop Wijmenga. He's a potato farmer in Friesland, and here we see him probably with the haul of a late summer potato harvest. As a farmer, as people probably know here, they're always busy. They never have days off, but Joop still managed to find some time to do bird work. He started by volunteering at the banding station, but at some point he heard about this special catching technique called wilsterflappen, and that's how he ended up collecting most of his data. And what makes Joop so amazing is this: he's incredibly persistent and precise in his collecting and analyzing of data. As some of you mentioned already, data collection and careful documentation is very important, and Joop is very good at that. Now, you heard me talk about wilsterflappen, this special catching technique. What is it? Well, first a little bit of history. The word itself, wilstes, or golden plovers, and flappen is to catch by turning over of the net. And this technique wasn't just used to catch European golden plovers, but also other waders and waterfowl. And not surprisingly, this was mostly done to supplement people's own food or for sales. And especially in the 1800s and 1900s, a lot of the sales were done to sort of upscale markets, both locally and as far as Harrods in London or markets in Paris, fancy foods. Now, the first evidence of this particular catching technique is visible in a painting from 1616, and likely it has been around a bit longer already. Now, throughout its history, there have been limitations on catching, as with any type of hunting, initially mostly by aristocracy, who of course felt that hunting shouldn't be done on their lands, or that certain game should be reserved for the elite only, and the peasants should only eat particular species that they didn't care for. And then additionally, around 1900 in the Netherlands, including Friesland, organized bird conservation came up. And this, of course, put further limitations on permits and catching from then on. And then by 1971, catching for the hunt was no longer allowed, only to catch and release in order to at least preserve the cultural heritage. But as you can imagine, many of these hunters, as they basically were, showed very little interest in catching just to release the birds again. And additional limitations on the catching method threatened this traditional catching method to disappear entirely. And I just want to show this picture here before we later describe in detail what the catching method looks like. This was taken around 1928, I believe. And here we see one of the catches ready to pull the net over. And I think it's just beautiful, this behind a little windscreen on his wooden shoes, klompen, ready to catch. Now, luckily, Joop Wijmenga led the charge to have the hunting permits changed to ringing permits. He had already been involved in the few people that were interested in the catching still, despite not being able to hunt them. And he helped the drive to get them changed to ringing permits. or banding permits, as we call them here. And this was achieved in 1998. And with that, he did not only preserve the cultural heritage, he also saved this important catching method as an aid for scientific research. Because now all these catchers could catch birds, measure them, and band them before release, yielding valuable data. So he took a disappearing traditional catching method to become an essential tool in scientific research, many of which was done with the aforementioned Turnus Wiersma. Now, if you want to learn more about this, there's more in this beautiful book here, as you see on screen, and I have it here. Unfortunately, it's all in Dutch. There's some section in Frisian as well, but it's been done in Dutch because there's just not that many Frisian speakers anymore. But there's also an English summary, and I think just the images alone are beautiful, a lot of historical images. Anyway, so now we have this great tool in catching birds and being able to monitor populations. But how do we actually catch them using this method? Well, here we see a catching setup. I think that's in my background as well, on a little converted bike carrier. Here in Alberta, we'd probably throw the stuff on a big pickup. In the Netherlands, to this day, there's still catchers that throw it behind their bike and bike it to the meadows from their home. Now, how does this setup look? Well, so the Wilster net, so the net itself is a fairly big net. So it's about 3.5 meters high by 20 to 25 meters long. This net is positioned in such a way that in open position is facing the prevailing wind. Very important for this catching method is that you have steady wind. Then by pegging both of its ends to a swivel point, which in turn is connected to the pulling rope, you're able to pull the net over to the other side. The pivot points itself help it turn over, the third one here. The wind assists as well. And as you know, with many species, including most waders species, they really prefer to land against the wind. So by having fake lure birds both in front and behind the net, flock of stopover birds that are around foraging, they like to visit conspecifics because in bigger numbers they're safer. It might also be an indication of food. They will see the lure birds from a distance and try to land with them. And as they approach this zone, the catcher, and this is not to scale, they'll typically be at about 30 to 40, 50 meters away from the net, will pull the net over just at the right moment and try and catch the birds. I was fortunate to be taught by Joop himself how this method worked. And here you see us looking over the haai, the skule, as it's called in Frisian, to look for coming birds arriving. And here we see them go low over the landscape, and the birds you see here are fake. Those are not real birds, and that's what they're attracted to. So this is what that looks like from the perspective of the catchers. Here we see the Wilsters, so European golden plovers, a huge flock in the background, probably a couple of thousand, and a smaller flock approaching the net. Again, with the lure birds, the fake birds in front and behind the net. And here we see the net, the post slightly buried in the meadow. And once the birds get close enough, here we see one of the catchers, Douwe, pull the net. And there we go. Caught about 10, 15 birds. And then it's a matter of running over and taking them out. And of course, then the most important moment is band the bird. So here we see Joop Wijmenga, not with the golden plover that we just saw, but with a ruff, a male, already in breeding plumage. And then, of course, we need to start measuring them. Now, this whole catching method is quite involved. There's a lot of important details that are very critical to getting it right and being able to actually catch birds. Doing the whole setup properly, having the right equipment. For the golden plovers, they use a special whistle. Joop has one around his neck here that they use to lure the birds by imitating its call. Interestingly, ruffs are notoriously quiet. They barely produce any sounds, but many of these catches are really used to catching golden plovers, they can't stop themselves from using the whistle and producing golden plover calls, even when it's roughs that are approaching. It doesn't deter the bird, so it doesn't hurt. Here we see Joop's mentor, who Joop learned this catching technique from. And here we see Yvonne Foucault, who was doing a PhD at the time and who was my supervisor in the field for the work that we were doing. And she has taught me a lot about science and the scientific process and all the things that come with it. Now, once we have the birds in our hand, we need to measure them. And Joop was very careful and precise with that. As I mentioned, he was very good at documentation and observation. And this is a graph of the wing measurements. So here we see a measurement of a ruff's wing being taken, a ruff in winter plumage. And I'll explain the graph here. Now, don't be scared, graphs aren't as hard as people sometimes worry they are. What we see here on the x-axis is the wing length. So we go from 150 here to 210. And on the y-axis, we see the frequency. That means how many of a particular wing length do we see. And then we see two peaks. On the left, in purple, we see females. And we can see that most females have a wing length of about 160. You can see there's about 100 females, just a bit less, caught with a wing length of 160. Males, the average is about 195 or so. Why is the peak for males so much higher? That's because males arrive on the stopover grounds in Friesland earlier than the females, and they stay longer. So they simply have a higher chance of being caught than the females. The females are also a bit smaller, so in some cases they manage to go through the loops of the net, depending on the net used. So this is one way that we can distinguish males from females before they get their breeding plumage. Females have considerably smaller wings than males. But when Joop looked a bit more carefully at his data, he noticed that he had another little blimp here, a little peak that was just in between the females and the males. So the question is, what's going on here? What does that mean? Any ideas? So I'm going to throw up another poll. Find out here. And I'd like you to tell me what you think could be the reason for this extra peak of wing length that falls right in between the females and the males. Take your time to read all the answers. I'll give a bit more time for this one. Yeah, more than half of you have already answered. Very good. Okay, I'll give it 20 more seconds. Oh, some interesting replies. Nobody thinks it's a data entry error. You have trust in Joop, that's good. All right. I'll share the results here. So we see most of you, 60%, over 60% thought it must be a newly discovered subspecies. Some think that it might be a mix of females and small males. And a few think it's small males, some think it's small females. And then a few think it might be data entry error. Now, most of these options were considered as the issue. And in fact, Teune Spiersma, the migration ecologist with whom Joop collaborates a lot, said, well, Joop, you must have made some errors, either in measuring or entering. But Joop, knowing himself, he was quite confident that that was not the case. Now, a side effect of this catching is that there are some birds that are killed in the process. Sometimes they hit the top rung of the net, but there's a steel cable, or for other reasons. Also, birds that were found elsewhere dead, they were all collected for their studies. Now, the number of birds that die in this catching method is very low, but of course, over many years with many catches, you always get some. Luckily, these birds aren't lost to science. They were all kept in freezers in case of any new questions arising, and that's exactly what happened here. So they went to freezer samples and remeasured and dissected these birds, including birds that fell in this wing length right in between the males and females. And what they found is that they were Faeders. What are Faeders, you wonder? Well, it's a female-like male. So those of you who said that they are small males, they were right. Faeders are small, female-like males. Interestingly, rather than smaller testes, they actually had bigger testes than regular males, the resident and the satellite males. But unlike those males, they do not mold to a breeding plumage with this elaborate ruff and tuft. They keep the same feathers as the females have and are hard to distinguish from the females. And both during migration and wintering periods, they associate with males rather than with females. But what about the lacking behavior? So we have now found, okay, these birds that don't look like males are actually males. We see that they're physically different. How does their behavior differ? So Joop and Teunus decided that we needed to take some birds to Canada, to a university where there was already a flock being studied, but they didn't have these Faeders. And he was lucky that he had a young, promising student working with him on a project. And she's from Canada and was about to head back. So that was quite an interesting opportunity for Teunus. Turned out she was also an interesting opportunity for me. I married Kimberly Matteau, and she's still my wife and teaching biology at and doing research at the U of A here. Now, I helped Kim travel to Schiphol, to the airport at Amsterdam, with a few Faeders in the carry-on. And before I had Kim take off with the birds, we gave them some water ready for the long trip in a different direction than they would usually migrate. Now, Kim handed them over to Dr. Dov Lank at the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, who had a big flock of ruff already, the regular resident and satellite males as well as females, where he looked at both behavior and genetics. So he now had some of these newly discovered Faeders as well and could look at their behavior. Here we see a sort of a situation that he would have them in a field with long and tall grass and some variation in habitat. And here we see a bunch of males sleeping on the right and a few females in the mix. And then on the left, a reminder of the different types we have. So the females, the slightly bigger Faeders, satellite males, and independent males. So Dov and his group looked not only at behavior, but also at genes. They found that the different tactics, including this new Faeder tactic, are all genetically determined. So based on the genes, what genes you have, you turn into a certain type. And he found that Faeders are dominant to satellites and satellites dominant to independent males. And for those more familiar with genetics, it turns out if you get the Faeder gene from both male and female, those embryos do not survive. Those eggs will never hatch. And that's why these Faeders are very rare. We only find about 1% of the individuals in the whole population as a Faeder, and they're always male. There we go. So amazing story. What a find. Now, this is all fine and well. We did some dissections on dead animals. They did lab experiments looking at the behavior in a cage. But what about wild birds? Because of course that's that's ultimately more telling how they behave in the wild. Now, during the study, a different study took place where many ruff were color banded, and over the course of the study, resightings came in from all over Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia. And most of those, of course, from the Netherlands, but also further north on the breeding grounds. And here we have more citizen science contributions. Anyone that reported color bands could send it in, would get a history of the bird, and some were even kind enough to send in their pictures. And one set of pictures in particular stood out, taken on breeding grounds in Wijmenga, Norway, in June 2004. And here's the picture that were taken by Jean Champion of a beautiful bird here, which looks to be a female. But then, of course, Jos Wijmenga, one of the assistants in the project, dove into the database based on the colors. We know exactly who it is, and found that this was actually one of the Faeders that we color banded. And even more amazing was the next picture we got from the photographer was this one. We see a male trying to mate with a Faeder, who is a male rather than a female. And this shows exactly how the tactic works, right? They sort of act as sneaky males, where they pretend to be a female, but then when the female becomes receptive and is ready to mate, they can sort of jump in. On the other hand, they can also prevent males from mating with a female by sort of pretending to be a male and to be a female, excuse me, and thus making the male lose his sperm to a male instead of a female. So this was a beautiful culmination of all that work that had gone into it and ultimately leading to such proof in the field. So I think a brief history of Dutch amateur birding, a report written a few years ago in the Netherlands summarized it very nicely. Joop Jukema is an enthusiastic and extremely capable researcher with excellent biological intuition. His tenacity during fieldwork and when analyzing and writing down data has led to a rich oeuvre, including some classic Dutch ornithological publication. It is clear that Joop is an impressive amateur ornithologist, and his output is on par with or even surpasses that of many professional ornithologists. And they also mention, which I thought was interesting in the same report, that observing birds was the most prevalent activity among birders, with bird ringing and bird collecting being also fairly common. So just like many of us here start with just, as a hobby observing birds, that's how most of these people that end up publishing or finding important things started as well. So there's a place for all of us to do that. So whether it's contributions via iBird, iNaturalist, volunteering at the banding station, all of that can be stepping stones to great discoveries. And just to emphasize how much that mattered what Joop did, this was his first paper that he did together with Teunis on this subject. They published it in 2006, the discovery of the Faeder. But in just a few short years, there's been really a boom of papers all based on this study, further exploring Faeders, the behavior, genetics, etc. Very impressive. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening. These are a lot of the people involved in the work. I want to thank Yvonne Vergaal for being my supervisor and buddy in the field, teaching me loads of things about how to do science. Jos Wijmenga, the assistant working in the field site there, and Teunis Wiersma leading the research together with Joop, and all the wilsterflappers involved in catching all these ruff, led by Joop Jukema. Here seen holding a Pacific golden plover, and finally my wife Kimberly Matteau and daughter Emma for feedback on this talk, and the many other people involved in this project. So thank you all for listening, and wonder if you have any questions. I'll switch off the recording first.